Okay, let's try this again. So not a whole lot of kind of housekeeping stuff here today before we get going. Um, I mentioned yesterday, so we've got that kind of fourth Canvas discussion due at the end of the day next Tuesday. I would start working on that early to get it out of the way. I've already kind of been dealing with a couple last minute submission issues with Canvas discussion 3. You know, you've got several days to get this done. Don't wait till 11:30 p.m. the night that it's due, right? And if you have issues, it's a lot harder to get those kind of resolved. And so get started in this early. Today we kind of had that module 10 and reading and module quiz due. So I'm assuming today that you've watched module 10's video. I'll start with a little bit of material from module 9. We'll then look at some questions from module 10, and then we'll jump into kind of module 11, which the top hat reading was not due today. It's not due until before tomorrow's class. Hopefully, a lot of you were able to kind of complete it before today. It kind of will help with the effectiveness of what we cover. But that should be kind of everything here. I forgot to kind of post these to the main homepage, but underneath quiz materials, I've kind of added that fifth set of practice problems. So you can kind of start working through those after today. We'll have covered all of module 9. There's a couple questions on there from module 10, and then the remaining like 8 or 9 questions cover module 11, which we'll go through today and tomorrow. Okay. Any questions from me before we get started here? Okay. All right. So, yeah. So what did we leave off kind of thinking about with module 9? So going to revisit one of the topics we kind of ended on, which was this idea that when we change taxes, doesn't matter what type of taxes they are, there is going to be some initial shift in aggregate demand, but then we're starting to focus on secondary effects. So I got a kind of question on this, or a couple questions. We're looking at these problems for this next quiz or exam. We're going to be having a lot of secondary effects, right? And so here we said if we decrease taxes, that's going to lead to individuals, companies having more money to invest in education, increase the labor supply, or increase productivity, or even the effectiveness of capital. So it's going to impact one of those factors of pull. We worked through examples where we were looking at expansionary fiscal policy. So I want to look instead here at contractionary fiscal policy. And I think I might have got through this with one section, not the other. But I want to kind of revisit it and do maybe a review here of what we're thinking, because we're going to keep using this aggregate demand, long run aggregate supply model. Okay. So let's assume that we kind of start out and we've got this market, or I shouldn't say market. We're looking at this kind of depiction of GDP and prices. We've got some initial aggregate demand curve, and we start out here. Here's our long run aggregate supply. Here's our short run aggregate supply. Let's just assume for now we have no inflation or deflationary gap, right? It would look similar if we had, say, well, when do we want to use contractionary fiscal policy? Typically when aggregate demand is too high. Okay. So if that wasn't the case, right, and we actually start out with no inflationary gap, this same thing would apply if we did have an inflationary gap, but this I think will help kind of make a point. So this was kind of our initial price level, and our initial long run and short run GDP were exactly the same. And it's supposed to be an S. So the first initial change was we've got contractionary fiscal policy through the increase in taxes, right? How do we reduce GDP? We increase taxes. So I shift the aggregate demand curve down here. Once again, in these problems, I would give you an assumption that short run aggregate supply doesn't change. It likely does. Or excuse me, sorry, I haven't got to that point yet. So we've just done the aggregate demand shift. So sorry. So we've got kind of what's our new short run GDP down here. So now our short run GDP is now less than that initial kind of long run GDP. So we've created a recessionary gap, right? Now we only did that because we started out with no gap. If we had started out with an inflationary gap, potentially by increasing taxes, we actually could eliminate that inflationary gap. However, when we engage in this contractionary fiscal policy by the use of taxes, well, increase in taxes takes money away from companies or individuals. They can't invest as much into education, technology to improve productivity, or physical investments in that make physical capital more effective, or they don't increase, they actually decrease their labor supply. So what we would see kind of simultaneously, right, is a decrease in long run aggregate supply. So what could happen here, right? Uh, I would have to give you the relative size, but let's say, so I think the examples we worked through last class, it was always that kind of shift in long run aggregate supply. We were looking at larger shifts. Let's assume that we have a larger shift coming from these taxes, right, than the shift caused by the changes in these factors of pull, right? If that's the case, right, then that decrease in GDP from these decreases in taxes, well, the shift in my long run aggregate supply is going to be much smaller. So if that's the case, kind of where is this new kind of, oh, sorry, new long run GDP? Right? It's going to be where it hits my new aggregate demand curve. So notice here, I still have a recessionary gap. It's just not quite as large once I have that secondary effect. And we worked through an example, I think last class, where we had a recessionary gap that was created because of these tax changes. And then the secondary response, it didn't eliminate that recessionary gap, it just made it smaller. Okay. Now, what if instead, excuse me, so what if instead I saw smaller shift in taxes than the factors of pull? So now I've got a really large shift in my long run aggregate supply curve. So here, this was like our second long run aggregate supply. Here's our kind of hypothetical third. Well, now where is my new long run GDP? Out here. Now that short run GDP would actually be greater than this kind of third scenario, long run GDP, and now it would actually have an inflationary gap created by that secondary response. Okay. Now, it's likely in practice that this is more likely to be the case, that shift in pull, or sorry, change in the factors of pull would shift longer aggregate supply by a lower amount than the initial change in taxes. But it is hypothetically possible if I told you that this shift was actually smaller, or the change in real GDP from this increase in taxes was smaller than the increase or decrease in GDP from these factors of pull, we could end up seeing that we go from no gap, and instead of a recessionary gap, we actually end up with an inflationary gap. So all kind of those are possible outcomes depending on kind of that relative size of those changes in GDP caused by the change in taxes and the change in the factors of pull. I should say those factors of pull, but any questions on that? So I wanted to revisit that just to kind of, I don't know, make sure we get more and more practice with these models. So the next thing we'll do to kind of finish up, excuse me, module 9 is thinking about kind of tax revenues. So if I think about tax revenue, it's going to be and it looks similar to when we were looking at this kind of relationship between GDP growth and then calculating kind of what is nominal GDP, price times quantities. Well, here we're looking at tax revenue. So tax revenue is going to be whatever quantity of goods that are being sold, or we could think of this as the dollar amount that is being spent on these goods times whatever the tax rate is. So if the tax rate was per unit, it would be the number of units times the tax. If the tax like is a sales tax, it'd be the number of dollars spent on these goods times whatever that sales tax is. But regardless, we can think about tax revenue is this tax times whatever unit we're kind of measuring, either or sorry, however we're taxing something, if it's the number tax on every unit or the tax on every dollar. So we know that when we increase these taxes, right, we're going to see labor supply decreasing, right, which means income levels will be income levels will be smaller. People are buying fewer goods, so at the same tax rate, we're going to generate lower tax revenue. However, that may not necessarily be the case initially, right? So we kind of think about, this will always be the case, but initially, those changes in labor supply, right, might be relatively small. Okay, so it will be kind of mitigate the effect of a tax increase, but it won't completely change the direction. So if we increase taxes and tax rates are currently low, so think about this going from like 0 to 1 cent sales tax. Well, that's not going to change the amount of goods people are buying by very much. And we weren't generating tax revenue before. Now we're going to generate quite a bit. And I'll kind of go through this kind of with some directional arrows to think about this here in a second. So we're going to be able to increase tax revenue. However, right, people, and then you can also think about this as if it was an income tax, not a sales tax. As we increase that income tax, yes, people might work less than before, but we wouldn't see people like leave the labor force. So that change or that decrease in labor supply, that factor of pull in response to that change in taxes, that change won't be relatively high. Now, as tax rates go up, right, more and more people are working less because it's, providing every hour worked is providing them with less income than before. Also, if the income value gets low enough, I might decide to stay at home, right, as opposed to go and enter into the labor force. So we're going to see the number of people who start to drop out of the labor force increase. So we get very responsive changes in the labor supply. Even if it was the same increase in taxes, right? So we might be going from like, I don't know, taxing income from 1,000 to 2,000. Well, that's going to be a very different response in labor supplies if I'm taxing it 10,000 to 11,000, right? Same change, but a higher amount. Okay. So what tax rate is going to be optimal? Well, it's wherever tax revenue is maximized. So we've got a curve that explains this, which is the Laffer curve. And I'll kind of walk through this intuition again and build this kind of curve out for us. Okay. So we said that initially, right, I could think about this as I've got the overall level of taxes, and then as a result, what is the tax revenue that's generated? We can think about tax revenue as whatever that tax is times either the quantity of the good being purchased. We said we could think about this as like the dollars spent on those goods. If it was a sales tax, we could think about this as whatever income is, if this was an income tax. And so we'll kind of discuss kind of all three types, but which kind of change this the same way. So if taxes are zero, how much tax revenue are we generating? Zero. Now, initially, when taxes are low, so let's say I'm making $100,000 and taxes go from 0 to 1,000. Well, I'm still making 99,000. If I was choosing to be in the labor force before, it's likely I'm choosing to remain in it. Also, I'm probably going to work about the same number of hours or kind of take similar jobs to kind of earn that $100,000. And so initially, that decrease in our labor supply is going to be relatively low in terms of a percentage change compared to that percentage change that we saw in taxes, right? Going from 0 to 1,000 is a huge percentage change in taxes, right? So that's going to increase tax revenue by a lot whenever that percentage change in taxes is greater than that percentage change in either the number of units, income, or kind of dollars spent. Right? So initially, that first like $1,000 increase in income taxes is going to increase my tax revenue by a lot. Now, as I continue to kind of do that, if I'm thinking about now, I'm looking out at like values of um, 30,000, and I'm going from 30,000 to 31,000. So same kind of increase here, but this is going to be a relatively low percentage change in taxes, right, compared to before. So as I start to get to higher and higher amounts, well, going from 100 to 99 might not change my decision, but as I get to higher and higher taxes, lower income levels, I might start to see people be more likely to drop out of the labor force. So in that scenario, right, I'm going to see percentage changes in that quantity of goods being purchased and the quantity of labor the quantity of labor. I'm going to see more people kind of drop out. So that percentage change in income, it's starting to get smaller and smaller. So the percentage change in my taxes now starts to become, you think about this difference between the percentage change in taxes and the percentage change in income, etc., kind of the number of units we're buying, it starts to go down. So now it's more likely, right, that I see that percentage change in taxes be a little bit lower. So now maybe I see like I'm increasing taxes still. So I'm seeing tax revenue go up, but not as much as before. And the response I start to see, sorry, I'm over here now. The response I start to see here gets larger and larger. So even though these are working in opposite directions, the kind of total effect here is going to start to get lower and lower, right? That change or that slope of the curve is getting smaller and smaller. Now, eventually I get to this point where tax revenue is maximized. So maybe here to kind of think about this, maybe this is at like 50,000. Well, from there, if I continue to increase taxes, if I'm like out here, and let's say I'm at 70,000, if I go from 70,000 to 71,000, same $1,000 change in taxes, but the percentage change in taxes starts to get lower and lower. At some point, right, as taxes become a higher amount of income, that change in income is going to be really large compared to that change in taxes. So if we think about, excuse me, I'll come down here. If we think about tax revenue being the amount of the tax times, I could say here the amount of income. Well, now that percentage change in taxes, by increased taxes, it's a smaller percent, but that might, if I get down to the point where if I had $100,000 and taxes are 70, I'm only making $30,000. You then tell me I'm going to have to pay 1,000 more. I'm making 29. We're going to see more and more people really start to kind of, consider, do I want to stay in the labor force? And a lot more people drop out. So that increase that we see in tax is going to start to be relatively small compared to that decrease in income because more and more people are kind of dropping out of the labor force. And we start to see overall the effect is that we see that taxes start to decrease. And then if we get to the point where all of income is taxed, nobody, right, has any income, we're back to that point where tax revenue would be equal to zero. So what is the optimal tax wherever we would get kind of to that highest point on our Laffer curve or to the highest point of tax revenue. So this is very similar to what we talked about with economic growth. It's just here, instead of looking at real GDP, we're looking at the overall level of taxes and comparing that um, to the tax revenue that's generated, okay, compared to prices and the overall level of GDP. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? Make sure I look at the chat. Okay. All right. So kind of looked here to kind of summarize this, right? Um, Module, kind of wrap it up. Why might some of this fiscal policy that we have, whether or not we're changing taxes, whether or not we're changing government spending, what might be the problem in terms of can we actually close these inflation or recessionary gaps? Well, we already talked about one of the issues is that there are secondary effects either from labor supply or these factors of pull, or from changes in, we said, net exports, right, as prices change. There also might be time lags, right? So this is the idea that we don't recognize the inflation or recessionary gaps right away. Potentially, even though we engage in these policies like taxes, it might take a while to get these tax codes written into law. Also, there might be some political issues, which aren't really the focus of this class, but they would exist. And then, um, once again, it could just be that people don't, there's a time lag in the terms of people don't adjust their behaviors. So maybe I don't start to adjust my labor supply until I actually see the amount of income I'm earning going down. Um, so it might just take people or companies time to recognize these government spending or, injecting more money into the economy or their kind of tax policies. It might just take consumers and companies time to recognize these. Okay. Any questions there before we jump into a little bit of review, I should say, if you've watched that video, module 10. Okay. So we kind of worked through and we looked at that daily quiz last class, but I want to make an emphasis on something else that was kind of talked about in that module 10 video, which is what if instead of deposits to the Fed, they have this other ability. So we've got US kind of government-backed bonds and securities, and the government can sell or buy those bonds back. So if that's the case, what is the overall effect on our money supply going to be? Now, the reason why I'm reviewing this is because in Module 11, we are going to start to reuse this idea of the government buying or selling securities and the impacts that that has on our money supply market. So here, if I think about, we said initially, let's say I had an example where I've got a new deposit, right, into the Fed, and it is $200,000. Okay. Well, if this is a new deposit, we said, and here I'll be a little more specific, kind of our total reserves, right, have increased by 200,000. However, kind of these required reserves that we have to set aside are going to be that 200,000 times whatever that required reserve ratio is. So here, I think in this example, oh, I might want to change these values for a second. Yeah, sorry, this was in the problems. This is the kind of last slide. I did 100,000 instead. Won't really change much, but just to kind of keep it consistent. And then the required reserve ratio was 8%, or if we kind of use this in decimal form, 0.08. Right? So how much money do we have to kind of set aside in these required reserves? Well, it's not going to be the full 100,000. It's going to be that 100,000 times whatever that required reserve ratio is. So here that's going to be what? $8,000? I'm doing math. No. Yes, I'm doing math in my head correct. Okay. Any questions up to this point? So my excess reserves. So one way to think about it is my total reserved is equal to my required reserves plus my excess reserves. So here, what do I have left after I put that $8,000 aside? I've got $92,000. This is the amount, these excess reserves, that I can then loan out, right? Now we said as we loan these out over time, right? I put money out there, people then kind of make new deposits, et cetera, into these banks. And so the total effect on our money supply was equal to those excess reserves times 1 over that required reserve ratio in decimal form. So for us here, that would be 92,000 times 1 over 0.08. So 92,000 divided by 1 over 0.08 gives us, no, what did I do here? Not divided by, sorry. Multiplied by, right? And so here we would have what? 115,000. So that initial excess reserve of 92,000 ends up increasing the money supply by like over $1 million. Okay. Now, what if instead of this initial deposit, we have that the government can buy US bonds or securities? Okay. Well, if it's purchasing these bonds or securities, what is it doing? It's putting money back out there into the economy. So if the Fed kind of buys these bonds or securities back, it's not going to be new deposits, right? They're essentially this amount of money. It's not a new deposit, so it's not we are required to kind of set any of that aside, right? So if they buy a security for that same $100,000, the initial amount, if you want to think about it as excess reserves we have, well, these bonds or securities, that amount of money is not subject to our required reserve ratio. So you could almost think about this as like the amount of excess reserves we initially have would be 100,000. Now, once we loan out that 100,000, so these banks have kind of now, once once the Fed buys these bonds, they give them that $100,000. It's not subject to that required reserve ratio. They then loan that full amount out. The amount that comes back into the bank would be $100,000. How much do they have to set aside? 8,000. So when we're looking at what's the change in my money supply, if instead that $100,000 comes from the Federal Reserve buying bonds and giving me that kind of injection of $100,000, well, the initial amount that I loaned out, right? That's the amount that gets kind of plugged into that total effect for the money supply. So that change in the money supply would be the initial amount loaned, which here it would have been 92,000. Down here, it's now 100,000, the full amount, and then times 1 over that required reserve ratio. So times 1 over 0.08. If we then kind of do this calculation, notice that when it's the US buying these bonds, right, it's going to actually be a larger effect than if that money comes into the bank initially through a deposit, right? Because when it's a deposit, before we get to being able to loan those funds out, we first have to set a certain amount aside to meet that required reserve ratio. When it comes in as a U.S. Purchased, the Fed purchases a bond for me, it comes in that same amount, but initially it's not subject to that required reserve ratio, so it becomes the total amount I loan out in that like first step, if you want to think about it that way. So those are the differences of comparing like a checkable deposit to if the government buys a bonds in terms of how much each of those would impact our money supply. Oh, am I messing my numbers up here? I might be looking at there's too many zeros. 1, 2, 3, 4. No, it's a million. Am I doing? So I have what? $100,000 times 1 over 0.08. So yeah, that should be 125,000,000. 125,000,000. Yeah, unless I'm. Is anybody else getting that? Anybody else want to check my math and let me know if it's
I got the same thing as you.
okay? There, you might be missing a zero. Maybe you put in 10,000. That would make sense. Any other questions before we keep moving here? So that's the main thing that I want to talk about or review from that module 10. That's really going to be the primary focus of what I ask you, right? So it's going to be how do these new deposits or how does the Fed buying or selling securities impact the overall money supply? And the reason why is we're going to start to reuse this today. Now, just to kind of mention, I just worked through an example where they buy securities. What would happen if they sell them? Well, there they're taking money away from the banks. So it would still cause a change in the money supply. But if the Fed sells bonds or securities and takes money away from banks, there's going to be an initial change where it decreases the money supply. And then we would kind of use the same method to see kind of what's the total decrease in that money supply once that available funds is like no longer able to be loaned out. So it's almost like if you took B251, when they sell securities, that change in the money supply kind of comes from like it's an opportunity cost. That if I had the money, I could be loaning it out. Okay. Yes. Yep. If it was that I'm selling the securities, it would be that 1,250,000, but a decrease. Okay. Any other questions before we kind of get going here? Jump into module 11. Okay. So we just went through module 10. We'll now kind of jump into module 11 and kind of reuse some of these concepts. Okay. So if we think about the tools that the Fed has, right, it's not just that they can buy or sell securities. We said they're also going to be able to set that required reserve ratio, right? So kind of the interest rate on reserves, right? We can try to set those, or we can kind of buy and sell securities through open market operations. We can adjust that required reserve ratio. So that's going to be a little bit different. This is the amount of, money that the bank kind of sets aside. This is an interest rate that they're going to require if they loan those reserves out. And then there's going to be a discount rate on the purchase of those bond securities. So we kind of go through all these. Well, here, there we go. So if we increase interest rates on reserve, so if interest rates are higher, borrowing is more costly, people borrow less. Well, if people are borrowing less, we're going to have less money out there in the economy, right? They're not increasing their income, they're not increasing the amount of money they have to put into investment in physical capital, whether or not this is businesses or consumers. And so we're going to see a decrease in the money supply, right? Because we're not kind of purchasing these loans because it's more costly with higher interest rates. Now, if I think about decreases in that interest rate, well, that encourages borrowing, right? It's less costly, so there we would see an increase in money supply. So this is, I think we've kind of discussed this in terms of like investment, right? So if interest rates were higher, we saw less investment. Essentially, there's lower kind of amount of dollars put into these investments. There's not going to be as much money supplied, right, to the economy. So, or to these markets. So let's see here. If I then think about, well, what about open market operations? Well, if the US is kind of purchasing these treasury bills or US backed bonds and securities, right? If we buy them, we're giving the banks more money to loan out. So if we're putting more money out there, what's happening to money supply? It is increasing. If we sell securities, when we sell them, we're taking money away from banks, right? They're paying us to buy these bonds or securities. We're taking money out away from the banks. We're going to get decreases in that money supply. Okay. So it might maybe an easier way to think about this because it gets kind of, I don't know. For me, it's hard to think about these words of buy, sell, whether or not they increase or decrease. Think about it this way. If I buy something, I'm giving someone money, right? That puts money out there, it increases money. If I sell it, people have to give me money. I'm taking money away from them. We see a decrease in the money supply. And then we could think about, well, what about that required reserve ratio? Well, if we're thinking about that required reserve ratio, right, we were just thinking about whether or not that initial change comes from a new deposit or comes from the US buying securities and bonds. That change in our money supply was gonna be that like initial amount we had to loan out times 1 over that required reserve ratio. So if we increase that required reserve ratio as the Fed, what happens? This fraction goes down, so that change in the money supply is actually going to be lower. So by adjusting these required reserve ratios, the Fed can essentially change the amount that money supply changes by. Okay. And then the reverse would be true if we lowered kind of required reserve ratio, we would increase that change in the money supply. So decreasing the reserve ratio would increase the initial excess reserves that are being loaned out. Um, it also then kind of influences that denominator, making the money supply increase even larger. And then we said if the example I wrote out was if we have an increase in the reserve ratio, we have less initial money to loan out, and we're also seeing that kind of multiplier go down. And so we would have a decrease in the money supply there. So an example of this is, if we're thinking about what, do the Federal Reserve banks of different countries actually do this? Yes, right? So China in 2018 lowered their required reserve ratio. So what is that going to do? Increase their money supply. Okay. And then currently, I forget what year this occurred in. I think it has it in top hat. I want to say it's 2020, is they lowered it to 0%. So essentially, if we had a required reserve ratio of 0%, what would be true about the impact of an initial deposit or of buying a US security? Well, if the required reserve ratio is 0, the initial amount we have to loan out is exactly the same. That multiplier effect and the change in the money supply currently is actually the same, whether or not it's a purchase or sale of a bond or if it's an initial deposit into the bank from someone other than the Fed or from the Fed. Any questions on that idea? Just kind of looking at some like actual values there. And then the kind of the fourth tool that the Fed has is discount rates. So this is going to be an interest rate that's not charged on the purchasing of reserves, but kind of lending them out. So we rarely see this used, but if I increase that discount rate, it has very similar effects, right? Increasing the amount of money that I have to pay to lend these reserves out means I'm going to have to pay more, and so borrowing is more costly. I'm less likely to borrow. I'm putting less money out there. We get a decrease in money supply. The exact opposite. Oh, did I forget to change this? Yes. I copy and pasted this probably to create the slides and didn't realize. So this would be encourages borrowing, right? Everything works in the exact opposite direction. So all of these kind of changes in terms of the discount rate, the interest rate that's charged on reserves, or the required reserve ratio, all of them, right, have kind of the same directional changes, right, on the money supply. Okay. And there, the only one that's kind of different or harder to think about is the purchase or the sale of US bonds and securities. So these are the four tools that the Fed has to change the money supply. Right? So we're then kind of going to take a step back and think about, okay, what's happening when we change the money supply, right? And what we're going to focus on here is what's happening to prices or what's happening to real GDP. So we have this theory of money, which is whatever the amount of money that's held by the public is, well, it doesn't really change real GDP if they hold on to all of it, right? If they don't spend it on anything, it's not going to change real GDP. Now, as they start to increase, right, the amount of money that they have and they're actually spending it, right, and they have more money available, they're going to increase real GDP. So increases in M are kind of matched with these increases in Y, right, which is real GDP. Now, price levels, right, are also going to be a byproduct of that, in that when we see the money held by the public go up, the amount of goods it can buy, right? Well, it kind of depends, like whatever output is, kind of the nominal value we have is kind of that initial output times whatever current prices are. We haven't adjusted for prices. So kind of changing the money supply there kind of increases, it could be this entire product. And then how much of that money people are spending as that increases, right? Or the number of times that we see the amount of money held by the public kind of reused. You can kind of think about the velocity of money is kind of connected to like that marginal propensity to consume. Um, then that's also going to increase kind of real GDP. And so any change in anything on this side of the equation is matched with a change in something on the other side. Okay. Excuse me. So we can also not just think about this as the overall level, we can write this as changes as well, which is kind of how I was describing it, right? Changes in the money supply could cause, you know, would have to be matched by a change in either prices or real GDP, and then change in the velocity of money had to be matched with kind of a change in those as well. This kind of quantity theory of money, these will always be equal. So, I could go through and look at what really is a change in prices. Well, a change in prices is inflation or deflation, right? If we see increases in prices, that change in prices goes up, we've got inflation. If it goes down, we have deflation. So if we change kind of the money supply, right, how do we see that? What's that connection between prices? Well, if I change the money supply, I should see that prices go up, and we'll talk about why in a second. But right, I need both of these sides of the equation. If money supply goes up, something over here has to go up as well, and we're going to end up showing that it's prices, or it could be a combination of prices and real GDP. So when we look at changes in the money supply or money growth rate, they're typically matched with changes in prices or increases in prices that would kind of be or measured by inflation. Okay. So, we could think through some like numerical examples here. So let's say I had an example where money growth or the change in the money supply is 3%. Um, there's an increase in the times that this money is spent or the velocity of money of 5%, and that GDP, that change in Y, that change in GDP or the growth is 8%. What must that level of inflation be? Because what is inflation? It's that change in prices. I mean, this is going to be a pretty basic example or a pretty easy question if you get this, because you're just plugging in three of these values and you're solving for the one that you don't know. So if we were to kind of do this, we're just plugging in 3% here. We're plugging in, oh, sorry, 5% here, plugging in 8% here. How do I solve for P? 3 times 5 divided by 8. So if I do that, okay, I still have my calculator down here. It's not showing up to me, so I can't quite do this one. So let's see. So we had what? 3 times 5 divided by 8 should give us what? 1.87. I got this entered in my calculator. 3 times 5 divided by 8. Yeah, 1.875 would be kind of my inflation rate here. Okay. Any questions? And I'm not going to spend as much time. I don't think that that's too bad. Okay. So I think here we'll start talking about money supply and money demand and the impacts that this is going to have on uh, equilibrium price levels, but also kind of interest rates. And so here, let's think about if I'm holding money, right? There's more available funds. I'm going to want to increase my spending, right? So this desire to hold money or to have money is that what we'll call money demand, right? So if the Fed is changing interest rates, that's typically what the news says. Well, it doesn't have to necessarily change interest rates, right? It's really changing interest rates through the buying or selling of securities or through setting that required reserve ratio. So it's not a direct control, but as a byproduct of the tools it has, it can influence those interest rates. Okay. So the types of money demand that we're going to have are what we'll call transaction demands, right? So this is the idea that I need money if I'm going to purchase things or as an exchange of payments. So as nominal income goes up, I need more money to kind of purchase these goods. Remember, nominal income is prices times quantity. So I need a higher amount of money to buy the same number of goods. Precautionary demand is I might want more money today because I think I might have future expenses, right? So we can kind of think about if I believe I'm going to have unplanned expenditures in the future, this could be directly related to interest rates because in order to have this money for the future, I have to borrow, right? So they're kind of that connection. If I have higher interest rates, it's more costly to borrow. Um, so I may not kind of have as high of a precautionary demand. So when would this type of demand be lower? Well, if I think that there's going to be lower expenditures in the future, right? We'll kind of, maybe if I'm thinking about, there's lower taxes in the future, right? I'm going to have lower expenditures. I don't need to hold as much money today. And kind of the opposite could be true as well. Asset demand is going to be that also people need more money, right? Um, so that they can store that. And it's kind of similar to precautionary demand. It's like savings. I want to buy more assets so that I can store the value of my current money to have it in the future, right? So then this is the idea that if interest rates are low, right? Well, for asset demand, I actually, excuse me, would see that I'm decreasing at lower interest rates. I'm decreasing the amount of other assets I want to hold because they're paying off less. The returns are lower. So if I have lower interest rates, asset demand actually goes down, which means the money demand, the amount of current dollars I want to spend actually goes up. So all three of these are going to be related to um, interest rates, right? So the amount of money demanded will kind of vary in all three of these categories of interest rates. So if we think about what that market for money looks like, the quantity of money demanded when interest rates are lower, right? We want to hold more, currently want to hold more money. So like if the current interest rates are lower, the current amount of money people want to hold is going to go up. And then when interest rates are higher, right? Well, borrowing is more costly. I'm not going to want to take out as many loans. And so we're going to see at higher interest rates, the quantity of money goes down. Or, yeah, sorry. Or we can think about this at higher interest rates, the payoff for uh, investment in assets goes up. So we'll put more money into assets, less money into kind of the current amount of money that we have. So no matter what type of demand that we were talking about for money, all of them are going to be lower when interest rates are high, and all of them are going to be higher when interest rates are low. I had a question here I'm trying to get to. So is quantity of money the same as money demand? So in any market, right, the x-axis isn't the same as demand, it's the quantity demanded. All right, so if you've taken B251, if we're thinking about the market for any product, the price level changes the quantity demanded or moves us along the demand curve. Changes in interest rates change the quantity demanded of money. Right? Um, but we wouldn't really think about that. You can think about it, it's, what we're measuring on this axis is the actual amount of money demanded at this specific interest rate. And then if at every single specific interest rate, the quantity of demanded is higher, that's what we would kind of think about as a shift in the overall money demand. So when I say increases or decreases in the money demanded, I probably should have been a little more specific when we're talking about their connection to interest rates. It's the change in the quantity of money demanded at every single possible interest rate. And then changes in the overall demand for money would be shifts in this demand curve. So no matter what the interest rate was, we would see the amount of quantity of money demand to be higher or lower. Does that answer your question there? Same idea. We said it kind of like changes in prices moved us to different points on the loanable funds demand curve, or changed the point that we're on the aggregate demand curve. But changes in one of those factors kind of shifted the entire curve. Excuse me, I take a drink there. So hopefully that answers that question. Um, so at higher interest rates, I kind of already just talked through these ideas. The opportunity cost of holding money is going to be higher, so we see people kind of invest more into assets, hold less money. So that would kind of decrease our money supply, or sorry, decrease our money demanded, right, at higher interest rates. So this is this relationship between the demand for money and interest rates. So what are the things that might shift money demand? So if people have more available income, no matter what the interest rate is, right, they have more available funds to spend, right? So at every single possible interest rate, increases in income are going to increase money demand. All right. Now we'll look at what occurs if we have increases in money demand here in a second. Um, so I've already said this is kind of another way of thinking about it, that at every single interest rate, let me see here, got a shift. At every single interest rate, the amount of, or the quantity of money demanded is now higher when I have increases in income. Similarly, when prices are higher, at the same interest rate, I need more available funds, right? I need more money to purchase the same number of goods, right? So when prices go up, I need more money to buy the same number of goods. We're going to see increases in demand regardless of what the current interest rates are. So increases in income or increases in prices would both cause, right, money demand to go up. So if we go all the way back, why were we talking about that quantity theory of money? If I can get all the way back here. Well, because anytime we're thinking about if there's changes in prices or changes in GDP, or this was kind of the income, we can think about like consumers' income, national income is going to be kind of GDP, real GDP. That's going to then cause something over here to change, which we're going to think about. That's changes in the money supply. So there, any increase in kind of the money supply would be the demand that we have for money. So increases in income or increases in prices increase or shift that money demand curve to the right. Okay. Now, this is money demand. So what else do we need? We need money supply. So I'll think about how shifts in money demand impact interest rates in 1 second. Okay. So let's assume that we are instead thinking about money supply. Right? Well, ultimately, money supply is dictated by the amount of available funds that are out there, right, to loan out, right? So what's going to end up being true is money supply is actually fixed. That regardless of the interest rates, the current amount of money supplied to the economy is going to be the same in the long run. So we'll talk through this a little bit more in a second, but I want to start to kind of think through how we see changes in these equilibrium interest rates. So if I've got money demand, that quantity of money and then interest rates, we said that relationship is kind of um, inverse, or we have this kind of downward sloping demand for money. It's very similar to long run aggregate supply in that the quantity of money available is fixed. So regardless of the interest rate, that amount of available funds to be supplied to the economy is unchanged. Okay. So this would kind of identify our equilibrium amount of money in the economy and then equilibrium interest rates. So if we see increases in money demand, right? What we're actually, this could be in what we said increases in income, um, or increases in prices cause our demand curve to shift. What this is going to do is it's actually going to cause our interest rates in the long run to go up, but it's not going to change the overall money available in the economy. And then kind of the reverse would be true. If I had decreases in real GDP or kind of income, or I have decreases in prices, we end up with a leftward shift in our money demand curve. What impact would that have? It's going to lower equilibrium prices. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving? Okay. So I think we'll have enough time to go through this. So let's say that we're instead thinking about, well, what would cause shifts in the money supply? Well, what we want with money supply, if I have more people employed or more people working, what am I going to see? Well, there's more kind of available funds out there, right? And so we would kind of see an increase in the money supply. If we have price stability, right, then we're also going to think about we've got, um, if I had price instability or I had inflation, well, if prices are going up, I'm actually going to need to hold, or sorry, there's actually going to be fewer kind of available funds out there, right? Because people are having to spend a higher amount. If I have economic growth, that's going to cause there to be a higher number of um, units produced and sold in our economy, so kind of increasing the amount of money that's out in our economy. Or that's again financial market stability, kind of the same impact on prices. It's just that instead of the kind of sale and purchase of goods, it's the sale and purchase of these, stocks, bonds, etc. Okay. So what's going to happen to our money market if we see increases or decreases in money supply? So money supply, we can think about whatever the interest rate is on reserves, right? We can kind of influence the amount of total money out there. Or we said if I buy or sell bonds, or I change that required reserve ratio, or I change discount rates, all of those are going to impact the money supply. Or, this was the idea if we saw this new deposit or we had this purchase of a bond, that injection of cash in the economy, we said we were kind of calculating what the total effect on money supply would be. And then we kind of had those things that shift money demand we have already kind of discussed. Okay. So what would increase money supply? Well, if we buy securities, we're putting more money out there. We said that's going to increase, right, the money supply. If we had a decrease in any of those rates, interest rates on reserves, discount rates, on lending out those reserves or required reserve ratios. All of those, if they decrease, make it less costly, right, to borrow. Those were also going to increase the amount of available funds or the money supply. So we talked about those things, those in module 10. So what do increases in the money supply look like? Well, if I have one of these things change and I see this increase, the Fed kind of, let's say, decreases the required reserve ratio, that's going to, excuse me, increase our money supply, which does what to long run equilibrium interest rates? Decreases them. Okay. So this was the idea that the Fed is not directly setting interest rates, but it is changing one of these factors, right? Either buying or selling securities or bonds, changing required reserve or interest rates on reserves, um, which then cause a shift in money supply, which then cause a shift in interest rates. So they're not directly like changing the interest rate. They're like manipulating it through a specific channel. So here, I'll kind of think about if we were looking at actual data, what is happening to the, if we have this kind of federal funds rate, another kind of term for um, that the federal funds rate would be kind of the interest rate on those reserves. As that decreases, right? So we're seeing across time if that amount is, or sorry, um, the interest rates that we see on mortgages. So that's a good measure of interest rates as they fall, right? Um, what should be happening is that we see that would have to be matched with kind of decreases in output. So we'll kind of make this connection here. But we first, because what happens if interest rates change? We saw changes in investment, which shift the aggregate demand curve, which then changed price levels and changed real GDP. So there's going to be a connection between these interest rates and real GDP. So the Fed, by impacting the interest rates through their tools that they have, they're ultimately going to impact or could impact whether or not we have inflation or deflationary gaps. Okay. So we're going to kind of think about this is not fiscal policy, but this is going to be monetary policy. So we'll kind of work through, I think, those steps next class. But for today, I've got, oh, I got to publish it. I'll make it so it's indented here. So we're going to look at this daily quiz and just try to understand what's causing these interest rates changes. We'll kind of go down the next couple steps or the subsequent impacts of that interest rate change when we start class tomorrow. So let's take a look at this. Change the settings here real quick. We've got more than 15 or less than 15 minutes. We'll be able to kind of cover this. Oh, and then I should have hit build as opposed to kind of getting out of this. So I've got two questions in this quiz. We'll work through both of them. I don't think it's going to be too tough, right? Based off the markets that we've already talked about, changes in these things that are going to change money demand or money supply, we should be able to determine what impact that's going to have on equilibrium interest rates. If we have time, I'll kind of work through this question too. If we don't, I'll give everybody credit for it and we'll kind of start class. This is kind of what I said, the topic that we're going to start class tomorrow with. So I didn't have quite enough time to get there. I was maybe a little bit optimistic. So we'll work through this first one. So which of the following are to increase interest rates? So I've got changes in income, the buying of U.S. securities, the increase in the required reserve ratio, or a decrease in price levels. Okay. So I can kind of select multiple answers here. So let's kind of see what this is going to look like. Okay. So let's say I've got my money market. Okay, so I've got kind of the quantity of money here. And I've got my real interest rate. I've got my demand for money. And we said our kind of supply of money is going, regardless of the interest rate, is going to be the same amount. So we started out with kind of these initial equilibrium interest rates. Let's think about the first thing. Well, in this market, are price levels a factor? Well, we said, what does an increase in prices do? And actually, sorry, the question we have here is a decrease in prices. So if we have a decrease in prices or a decrease in income, right? Well, both of those are going to cause what? Our demand for money to go down. What does that do to our equilibrium interest rates? Well, I drew this pretty dramatic, but it's going to decrease them. Well, we're looking for what's going to increase those, so that can't be the right answer. Now, if I buy US securities, excuse me, what impact is that going to have? Well, if I buy US securities, right, that should do what? Well, I'm putting money out there, right, if I'm buying securities. And so what's going to happen if I buy securities? That's going to increase my money supply, right? If I increase my money supply, what's that going to do? Well, it's also going to decrease my interest rates, right? So that can't be the correct answer. Well, hopefully there's only one other option. So if I work through kind of the final option here, if I kind of have that same kind of money demanded and the same supply for money, here's my interest rates. Here's the initial starting point. The only one we had left was an increase in the required reserve ratio. So if you remember what was kind of that change in the money supply, it was kind of whatever that initial amount of loans that we had, loans, the initial amount of available funds we had to loan out times 1 over that required reserve ratio. So if we increase that required reserve ratio, that's actually going to cause a decrease in the money supply. Decreases in our money supply would do what? Raise real interest rates. Okay. So that's going to be the only option we have there that's going to increase real interest rates would be if we see increases in that required reserve ratio. Okay. So in the remaining time, I'll go through this quickly and we'll do some review next class, but I kind of want to foreshadow what we're going to be looking at and we'll dive deeper into why this is the case. So let's say I've got this market and we were thinking about the quantity of money and interest rates. So here's my demand for money. Here's my initial supply for money. Here was our initial equilibrium interest rate. Okay. Excuse me. If we want to close an inflationary gap, what should we do? Right? So let's say an inflationary gap exists. So now we're going back to our aggregate demand, long run aggregate supply model. We had aggregate demand and we had long run aggregate supply. If we had an inflationary gap, we knew that the current amount of GDP was too high. We want to lower it. Okay. So if we want to lower aggregate demand, what would we need? Well, we would need a change in one of these factors. If we're using monetary policy, we're influencing interest rates, which influence investment. So if I want to decrease aggregate demand to kind of close that inflationary gap, what do I actually want to do? I want to decrease investment. We said, what decreases investment? Well, what makes borrowing more costly? Increases in interest rates. So if I want to increase interest rates and I'm thinking about buying or selling US backed securities, well, how can I cause interest rates to be higher? Well, I actually need to um, take more money out of the economy. How do I do that? So hold on. How would decrease in price levels cause a decrease in demand? I missed a chat there, or I missed something in the chat there. Um, well, that was one of the factors we said changes the quantity or the quantity demanded of money. If we want to buy the same number of products at higher price levels, we would actually see more money necessary or more money demanded. So the reverse is true as well. If prices are lower to get the same output, we don't need as much money as before. Sorry, I missed that in the chat. So we've got what, a couple minutes left here. So where did I leave off? Sorry, I just saw that and I got a little derailed. So what was I saying? Oh, we want to increase interest rates. Well, if I want to increase interest rates, how could I do that through open market operations? Well, I want to decrease the money supply. How do I decrease the money supply? I take money out, away from businesses or consumers. So that would have to be instead of buying US bonds or securities, we sell them, right? We take money away or people are purchasing these bonds. Okay. So if we were to sell bonds, what is that going to do to real interest rates? It would increase them, right? And then, excuse me, if we um, increase those real interest rates, that decreases investment. We weren't asked that in this problem, but we could be. Decrease in investments do what? Decrease the aggregate demand, which would do what? If we think about these initial prices, that would decrease prices or cause deflation. Okay. So we're going to tomorrow start to connect this market for money, right, which the Fed can influence, that will then have secondary impacts, or if we kind of think about those impacts on interest rates, it'll then impact our aggregate demand curve, which then it could allow us to close inflation or deflationary gaps, or it could cause us to create those gaps. So we call this not fiscal policy. We're not changing taxes or we're not changing government spending. The government, which the Fed is a part of, I mean, they're kind of their own entity, but they're technically part of the government. They can change real GDP and price levels through not fiscal policy, but what we would call monetary policy by changing the money supply. Okay. Any questions there before we keep moving? So it's sell, increase, and decrease. Yes. What did I start out with? Inflationary gap, decrease real GDP. Oh, I have the correct answer, or the answer set wrong because I was just putting in the options. So I'll update those answers and kind of just have that regraded so that it's kind of the answers that we just worked through. So I put this together kind of last minute based off of what we are going to be covering today. And I just kind of set those answers in order and I forgot to kind of update on the back end what the correct answers were. But yes, this should be by increases and decreases, and I'll kind of get those scored correctly here in about 10 minutes. Okay. Questions on that before we keep moving, or before I end class, sorry. So I'll kind of stop the recording here. If you have any kind of additional questions, I can